A man's wedding night turned into a nightmare when he discovered the devastating truth about his wife, and it all ended in a brutal murder. How did this shocking discovery unfold, and what led to a tragedy that no one saw coming? The excitement and joy of what should have been a new chapter in life quickly turned to horror. The man, who had just married the love of his life, never imagined that the woman he thought he knew would harbor such a devastating secret. What would drive a man to kill his own brother and wife on what should have been the happiest day of his life? Stay tuned as we uncover the twisted layers behind this shocking and tragic tale. Who was the real victim, and who was pulling the strings behind? If you're as shocked by this story as we are, make sure to like this video so we can bring you more shocking true crime stories. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any future cases. Let us know in the comments if you've heard of this case before. Before the tragic events of that wedding night, 30-year-old David Johnson was a man who had it all. A successful businessman, David had built a stable life and was ready to share it with someone he thought he could trust. He was known for his calm demeanor, his charm, and his dedication to his work. David had always been the kind of man who believed in loyalty, both in relationships and in life. He had been searching for love for years, and when he met Catherine Matthews, a beautiful 27-year-old woman with a warm smile and a gentle nature, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. David had known Catherine for just under a year before they got engaged, and they had quickly become the talk of their small community. They seemed like the perfect couple. David, a hard-working man with a steady income, and Catherine, a caring, supportive woman who had recently moved to town looking for a fresh start. Their whirlwind romance seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Catherine Matthews had always been charming, always making people feel at ease. She had an undeniable sweetness, yet there was something about her past she never fully disclosed. Growing up in a family torn apart by secrets, Catherine had spent her early years running away from her family's dysfunction. She moved around frequently, trying to find stability, and David was the first person who seemed to provide that sense of home. But Catherine, despite her external warmth, had a more complicated side, a side that would soon unravel in the most unexpected of ways. She had grown up in a household where her own father was emotionally distant, and her relationships with men often lacked the commitment she longed for. But when David came into her life, things changed. She was drawn to his stability, his focus, and the comfort he provided. They were married quickly, and before long, they were planning a future together. However, what David didn't know was that Catherine was hiding a devastating truth, one that would change everything. And then there was Ethan Matthews, Catherine's 32-year-old brother. A charismatic and charming man, Ethan had always been close to his sister, even though their bond was somewhat unhealthy. Raised in the same chaotic household, they relied on each other more than they should have. Ethan's relationship with David had been one of surface-level cordiality, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Ethan, though outwardly friendly, harbored resentment and jealousy, especially when it came to his sister. His feelings were buried deep within, and he often masked them with casual conversations or friendly gestures. However, in the quiet moments, those emotions festered. David had no idea how complex the relationship between the siblings truly was. Ethan's jealousy of David grew as he saw his sister fall deeper in love with the man she was about to marry. Ethan's resentment was further fueled by his own personal struggles, feeling overshadowed by his younger sister's apparent success and the attention she was getting from David. Now, with the wedding behind them, David and Catherine were off on their honeymoon, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. Their wedding night was supposed to be the beginning of their happily ever after. The excitement of their new life together filled the air. The couple was deeply in love, eager to start their future as husband and wife, imagining their life filled with joy, adventure, and success. David had always dreamed of a wife who would stand by him, someone he could trust implicitly. And for the first time in years, he thought he had found that in Catherine. But just hours into their honeymoon, something dark would come to light, and David would discover a secret about his wife, one that would tear his world apart. What happened that night, what Catherine had hidden for so long, would soon unravel. What should have been a moment of celebration turned into a nightmare no one could have predicted. Now that you've met the key players in this heartbreaking case, do you think any of them could have acted differently? Comment below with your thoughts on their actions. Share this video with your friends who might also be interested in this twisted tale. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories. On the outside, David and Catherine's relationship appeared to be the epitome of love. From their first date to their wedding, everything seemed seamless, like a fairy tale romance. David, a man of routine and stability, was captivated by Catherine's beauty and warmth, and in turn, Catherine was drawn to David's grounded nature. They enjoyed the same interests and had a mutual respect for each other's values. To David, it seemed as though Catherine was the woman he had been waiting for, someone who could offer him the deep emotional connection he had longed for. However, as the weeks and months passed, small cracks began to appear in their perfect marriage. In the beginning, Catherine had been the perfect wife, always attentive, always loving. But there were moments when David noticed she would grow distant, her mind seemingly elsewhere. At first, he chalked it up to the stresses of wedding planning and settling into their new life. Yet as time went on, Catherine's behavior grew more erratic. She would often be caught staring out the window, lost in thought, and sometimes even withdrawing from conversations. David, sensing a shift, but unable to place his finger on it, grew concerned. He had always trusted Catherine, believing in her ability to be open and honest. They had shared so much with each other, and for David, it was unthinkable that she could be hiding anything, especially something as big as this. He started to question whether their relationship had been as perfect as it appeared, or if something darker was lurking beneath the surface. David's trust in Catherine had been unshakable. He believed that love meant honesty, and they had always promised to be truthful with one another. When he married her, he vowed to trust her completely. But as the days wore on, David felt the growing unease inside him, a nagging feeling that something was off, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. David and his brother, John, had always been close growing up. The two shared a bond that went beyond just family. Having spent countless hours together as children, they had become best friends over the years. They leaned on each other through hard times, celebrated the highs together, and were, at least in the beginning, inseparable. But as they got older, things began to change. David focused on his career, and now his marriage to Catherine became more and more absorbed in his own life. John, on the other hand, found himself constantly in the background. His brother's growing success and marriage caused a rift that David, caught up in his own happiness, didn't notice. Deep down, John began to harbor feelings of resentment toward his brother's success and the way his life seemed to be falling into place so effortlessly. John had struggled with a career, relationships, and his own sense of identity, and watching David's life unfold so perfectly only made him feel more alienated. There were times when David would ask about his brother's life, but John would quickly change the subject or make excuses. There was a growing tension between the two men, one that no one talked about, but both felt. What David didn't know was that John had started spending more time with Catherine, and over the months, their interactions became more frequent. It wasn't clear if it was innocent or if there were deeper, more complex emotions involved, but David was left in the dark about what was happening behind his back. David trusted his brother implicitly, never questioning his motives. But as the wedding night drew closer, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something John wasn't telling him. Perhaps it was just his paranoia, but he couldn't ignore the sense of betrayal slowly building in his gut. He had always trusted John, but now something felt off. And then came the discovery that would change everything. Was it a conversation? An accidental discovery? or something far more sinister entirely. The moment of truth came on their wedding night. David had no idea that what was about to unfold would shatter his world forever. The night was supposed to be one of bliss, excitement, and new beginnings. But David's mind had been racing all evening. Something about the night felt wrong. Catherine, who had been so excited earlier that day, seemed distant, distracted. They shared a quiet moment alone in their honeymoon suite. That's when David's eyes wandered to a detail that sent a chill down his spine. A pregnancy test, barely hidden on the bathroom counter. At first, David thought it must be a mistake. Maybe Catherine had left it there by accident, or it was from an earlier time. But as he picked it up, his heart sank. The test was positive. David confronted Catherine immediately. She looked startled, her face paling as she realized the truth had come to light. He asked her outright, "Are you pregnant?" The room fell silent, and for a moment, Catherine didn't answer. She was caught off guard. When she finally spoke, her words were trembling, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." David felt the ground beneath him shift. As Catherine confessed, the truth came out in a rush. She was pregnant, not with David's child, but with his brother John's. The shock, the betrayal, hit David like a physical blow. His world, which had seemed so perfect just hours before, now felt like it was crashing down around him. Catherine explained, "It happened before we got married. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to happen." She tried to rationalize her actions, but her words fell flat as David's rage and heartbreak boiled over. David's heart was breaking, but his mind was a whirlpool of emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. How could this happen? Why didn't she tell him sooner? How long had this been going on? As Catherine tried to explain, David's mind was racing. But one thing was certain. The woman he had married had lied to him, and worse, she had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way possible. The husband's world had been torn apart in a single moment. A secret that had been hidden for so long was finally exposed, and David was left to grapple with the aftermath. Would he be able to forgive her? Or would this devastating revelation lead to something far darker than anyone could have imagined? After the discovery, the emotional fallout was inevitable. Betrayal, shock, and anger flooded the husband's mind. What did he do next? David could hardly believe what he was hearing. The words Catherine had spoken, those 3 devastating words, "I'm pregnant with John's child," echoed in his mind over and over again. The betrayal was too much to process in that moment. He could feel his body physically shaking, but no words could escape him. His eyes locked on Catherine, his wife, the woman he had married with every expectation of a future built on trust and love. And now, everything was crumbling in front of him. The first feeling was shock. He couldn't wrap his head around it. His mind spun with confusion, questions, and disbelief. How could Catherine, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, betray him in the most unimaginable way? He had married her in good faith, with no reason to believe that something so vile could be hidden from him. The anger followed quickly, raging hot and sharp like a knife in his chest. He couldn't even look at her anymore. How long had she known? Why hadn't she told him before they got married? David's thoughts turned inward. Was he not enough? Was he just a convenient option? His chest tightened as the realization sank in that his own brother had not only betrayed him, but had also violated the sacred trust between siblings. His brother, John, the man he had always relied on, had crossed a line he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The anger wasn't just about Catherine's betrayal. It was about his brother's betrayal as well. How could John do this to him? And why had Catherine gone along with it? David's mind shifted quickly to John, his brother, the one man who he had trusted above all else. They had been close growing up, and David had never once thought that his brother would betray him in such a devastating way. Was this some long-standing affair that had been hidden for months or even years? Or had it been something that happened in a moment of weakness, a terrible mistake? The more David thought about it, the angrier he became. No matter how he tried to justify it, he knew one thing for certain. John had been involved, and he had to be confronted. David stormed out of the honeymoon suite and immediately called John. His hands trembled as he dialed his brother's number, his voice shaking with rage when John picked up. "We need to talk," David said, his words barely contained. John's voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as if he had been expecting this moment. "David, it's not what you think," John said, but David could hear the nervousness behind his words. The calm facade was cracking. David's anger boiled over as he demanded the truth. "Don't lie to me, John. I know everything. What the hell were you thinking? How could you do this to me? To Catherine? To our family?" The confrontation between the brothers was intense. David wanted to know why, how, and when it had happened. But John, ever the manipulator, tried to justify his actions, spinning a tale of weakness and regret. But it was clear to David that John had never truly cared about the damage this would cause. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, John downplayed everything, as though he expected David to forgive him. John's response to the confrontation was a mixture of guilt and deflection. He was evasive, never truly taking ownership of his part in the betrayal. He offered no apology, no real explanation for why it had happened. He tried to shift the blame onto David, subtly implying that maybe their relationship wasn't as perfect as David had thought. The conversation ended with no resolution, just a growing sense of betrayal that David could no longer ignore. His brother, the one person who should have had his back, was now a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable harm. As David hung up the phone, his stomach churned. This wasn't just about Catherine anymore. This was about his family, his brother, and the destruction of everything he thought he knew. Back in the hotel room, Catherine waited, unsure of what to do next. The moment of truth had come, and now it was only a matter of how David would react. She knew the marriage was over, but could she salvage some part of it? Could she explain her actions? Justify her betrayal? David's mind raced as he walked back into the room. The anger and confusion were still raw. He couldn't even look at Catherine. How could he? How could the woman he loved, the one he had vowed to stand by for life, have carried on such a destructive secret? She had broken their marriage before it even had a chance to begin. Catherine tried to explain herself, to rationalize what had happened. She said she never intended for things to get so out of control, that it was just a mistake, that she didn't know how to stop it. But her words felt hollow to David. There were no real explanations that could make this betrayal disappear. The trust that had been built over their months of dating, their wedding, their vows, everything had been destroyed in an instant. David began to suspect deeper issues within their relationship. Was this just a mistake, or had Catherine been hiding more than just this affair? Was this the breaking point of something far more profound that had been wrong all along? Were there other lies buried deeper than the one that had just come to light? The seed of doubt was planted, and it quickly grew into a powerful force that shattered his view of his wife, their marriage, and everything they had built together. With each passing minute, their marriage deteriorated further. The confrontation became more heated, with accusations and apologies flying in every direction. But no matter what Catherine said, David could not escape the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The bond they had shared was gone, and so was any chance of rebuilding it. What would happen when emotions hit their breaking point? The situation soon escalated to a shocking act of violence. The tension in the room was unbearable. David's heart was pounding, his mind clouded by anger, betrayal, and confusion. Catherine sat before him, her face pale, her eyes filled with regret and fear. She had tried to justify her actions, tried to explain away her infidelity, but the damage had been done. David had already seen the betrayal. He had already felt the sting of it deep within his chest. The conversation had been escalating for hours, each word throwing more fuel onto the fire of David's rage. Catherine had apologized repeatedly, but there was nothing she could say that would undo the hurt. David's thoughts spiraled into an overwhelming storm of emotions. The man he had trusted, his own brother, had slept with his wife. The woman he had pledged his life to, the person he believed would stand by him forever, had deceived him in the most unimaginable way. David's breathing became shallow. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. The pain of betrayal was consuming him. He could feel the anger rising, hot and sharp, but he couldn't contain it anymore. In a fit of rage, he stood up abruptly, his movements quick and uncalculated. He didn't know what he was doing, but his mind was clouded with fury. Catherine tried to speak, tried to reach him with words, but David wasn't listening. Without warning, David grabbed the nearest object, a glass from the nightstand, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the sound deafening in the silence that had filled the room. But that wasn't enough. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, David lunged at Catherine, pinning her to the floor. The violence happened so quickly, so unpredictably. One moment they were arguing, and the next David was choking her, his hands wrapped tightly around her throat. Catherine struggled beneath him, gasping for air, her hands clawing at his. But the rage was all-consuming. David's mind was a blur, his body acting without thought. The betrayal had ignited something dark within him, and he couldn't stop it. After what felt like an eternity, but was only mere minutes, Catherine's body went limp. The rage began to fade, and in the silence that followed, David realized what he had done. He stared at her, his mind racing. The woman who had promised him a lifetime together was now gone, because of his own actions. The murder left everyone in shock. How did the husband react immediately afterward? David was frozen. For a moment, he simply stared at Catherine's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the gravity of what he had just done. The anger that had driven him to such violence slowly began to dissipate, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. His chest tightened with disbelief. What had he done? In the silence of the room, the weight of the moment hit him. His breath was ragged, his body trembling. He didn't know what to feel. Was he relieved? Horrified? Remorseful? The truth was, David felt nothing at all. The shock of the murder had left him numb, unable to process the enormity of what had just occurred. As reality began to set in, David's mind started to race. What was he supposed to do now? He had just killed his wife who had betrayed him so completely. The betrayal had shattered his trust, his love for her, and in his anger, he had taken a life. But then, the thought struck him, what about John? The brother. He had to confront him now. The thought of facing John only fueled the fire of his rage once again. But it wasn't enough to act immediately. David stood in the room, dazed, unable to move. It didn't take long for the crime to be discovered. Neighbors heard the commotion, the shouting, the sounds of breaking glass and violence. Someone had called the police, but by the time the authorities arrived, David had already begun to process what he had done. The community was in shock, unable to comprehend how something so horrific could happen in their quiet neighborhood. When the police arrived, they found Catherine's lifeless body in the honeymoon suite. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, a glass broken on the floor, and signs of a violent struggle. There was no hiding what had happened. It was clear that this was no accident. David was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his body slumped in exhaustion and disbelief. When the police asked him what had happened, his response was almost robotic. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't put into words the emotions that had consumed him, nor could he fully grasp the gravity of his actions. All he could say was, "I didn't mean to do it." As the investigation unfolded, David's emotional state remained unpredictable. There were no outbursts of grief, no tears. Instead, there was a coldness that overtook him. He seemed detached, almost as though the act of killing Catherine hadn't fully sunk in. Whether it was the shock of the moment or the realization that he had lost everything in one fatal act, David showed no immediate remorse. The community, who had once seen David as a well-respected businessman, was now filled with shock and horror. No one could understand how a man who had seemed so normal, so loving, could commit such an act of violence. Friends, family, and even strangers who had known David were left reeling. How could someone like him do something like this? The police, though, saw through his detachment. They were trying to piece together the full story to understand the motive behind the murder. Was it just a crime of passion? Or was there something deeper, something darker at play? Only time would tell. As law enforcement became involved, they quickly realized they were dealing with a complex and deeply personal crime. Detectives quickly started piecing together the events that led up to the murder. The neighbors had heard the loud commotion earlier in the night, and some had seen David storming out of the hotel room, visibly upset, right after the confrontation. From the evidence, it was clear that a violent struggle had taken place. But what really stood out was the lack of an alibi. David was the only one in the room when the murder occurred, and there was no sign of a forced entry, making it nearly impossible to deny his involvement. The police began their investigation with David's background, his relationship with Catherine, his brother John, and their apparent perfect marriage. They spoke with friends, family, and neighbors to piece together the history of the relationships involved. But it wasn't until they began examining the scene in more detail that things started to fall into place. As investigators combed through the room, several key pieces of evidence were discovered that pointed directly to David's involvement. The most damning evidence was a bloody handprint on the bedside table, still fresh from the struggle. There were also signs that David had been the one to break the glass, possibly in a fit of rage, just moments before the murder. Blood spatter patterns were found on the floor and walls, consistent with a violent altercation, and the position of Catherine's body suggested a sudden and overwhelming attack. However, what caught the detective's attention was a piece of jewelry found in the room, Catherine's wedding ring. It had been found in David's pocket. It was the kind of detail that wasn't easily explained away. Did David take the ring as a symbol of the marriage he was about to destroy, or was it an unconscious act of control in his heightened emotional state? David, when questioned, was vague in his responses. His answers didn't line up with the evidence. He claimed to have no recollection of what had happened after the argument escalated. But the police could see through the facade. His behavior was far too composed for someone who had just murdered his wife. As the case moved to court, both sides prepared for a battle. What defense strategy did the husband's legal team pursue? As the investigation continued and charges were laid, the case quickly gained media attention. The public was shocked by the crime, but it was the sensational nature of the crime that captivated the community. A husband, on his wedding night, killing his wife? And not just that, but with his own brother involved in the affair? It was a tragic tale of betrayal, and it seemed too unbelievable to be true. David's legal team immediately began working on his defense strategy. His attorney argued that the murder was the result of an emotional breakdown. They claimed that David had been blindsided by the affair and the betrayal on the most important night of his life, which led to a temporary loss of control. The defense suggested that David never meant to kill his wife, that his anger and hurt had consumed him in the heat of the moment, and it was a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. This strategy of claiming temporary insanity would be the centerpiece of the defense. The team argued that David, overwhelmed by betrayal and grief, snapped and acted without thinking. His outbursts of anger, they argued, were consistent with someone who had been emotionally manipulated, not someone capable of cold-blooded murder. However, the prosecution was ready. They painted a picture of a man who had been controlling and manipulative. They argued that David's anger had festered long before that night. The act of violence wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of years of built-up emotions. The fact that David had no remorse, and his vague statements during his interrogation, further solidified their argument. The prosecution claimed that David's true motives were far darker than a moment of passion. He had killed his wife to punish her, and his brother, for betraying him in the most intimate way possible. How did the public perceive the crime? Was there sympathy for the husband, or did the public outrage outweigh it? The public reaction was mixed, but overall, it leaned toward outrage. The idea that David had killed his wife on their wedding night left many people appalled. How could anyone do that? How could someone betray the woman they loved and then murder her in cold blood, even if she had cheated on him? Some members of the community did feel sympathy for David, understanding that the betrayal had cut deep. They could empathize with the crushing pain of being deceived by both a wife and a brother. Still, there was a general feeling that no matter how much pain David felt, it didn't justify murder. Others were completely unforgiving, calling David a monster for his actions, feeling that the betrayal didn't warrant the violence that followed. The media coverage of the case was intense, and it quickly became one of the most talked about cases in the community. Public opinion was divided, but most were unanimous in their belief that David needed to be held accountable for the crime he committed. This polarized reaction only added fuel to the fire of the trial, and as the legal proceedings continued, more questions arose about what drove David to such an extreme act. As the trial came to an end, the truth about what had happened on that fateful wedding night was laid bare. David's defense team had tried to paint the murder as a crime of passion, a sudden outburst of rage triggered by the overwhelming betrayal he had discovered. But as the prosecution dug deeper into the case, the picture became clearer. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a planned act, one fueled by months of frustration, jealousy, and anger. David had snapped, yes, but there was a coldness to his actions that suggested something far darker than an emotional breakdown. The confrontation with Catherine had been the tipping point, but the anger and betrayal had been simmering beneath for much longer. Catherine's infidelity, combined with the deep betrayal by his brother, had built up inside David like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. When David was asked during his trial if he had premeditated the crime, his response was telling. "I didn't plan it," he said, "but I felt something snap inside me when I found out. I couldn't stop it." His words rang hollow, and the jury struggled to see past the excuse of a momentary breakdown. The final details of the crime painted a disturbing picture. David and Catherine had argued for nearly an hour before the fatal violence occurred. The physical struggle began when David became physically aggressive, throwing Catherine to the floor. In the heat of the moment, with his emotions overwhelmed, he had pressed his hands around her throat, choking her into unconsciousness. The blood spatter evidence showed that the violence had escalated quickly, but Catherine had fought back, scratching at his hands. Despite her efforts, David continued, ultimately ending her life in a fit of rage. The discovery of Catherine's body, the way it was positioned, and the immediate evidence that pointed to David's involvement left little room for doubt. There was no sign of a struggle outside of the room, no forced entry. This was a crime carried out in a moment of rage, but with enough deliberation to suggest it was not entirely spur of the moment. After a lengthy trial, the jury returned a verdict of second-degree murder. They ruled that while David's actions were not entirely premeditated, the crime was born of a calculated emotional breakdown, driven by his deep sense of betrayal. His legal team had argued for manslaughter, hoping to reduce the charges, but the prosecution convinced the jury that David's actions were too violent and premeditated to qualify as anything less than second-degree murder. David was sentenced to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that left the courtroom divided. Some believed that David had been emotionally pushed to the edge by the weight of the betrayal and deserved a lesser sentence, while others felt that no amount of emotional turmoil could justify the murder of his wife. The sentencing was met with mixed reactions, but the case was considered closed. The emotional toll on both families was immeasurable. Catherine's family, who had once welcomed David into their fold, was shattered by the loss. They expressed nothing but anger toward David, feeling that his actions were unforgivable. They had lost their daughter, their sister, and their loved one, and they couldn't find any compassion for a man who had taken her life in such a brutal manner. On the other hand, David's family was torn apart by the case. His parents, who had always been proud of their son, were devastated by his actions. They struggled to understand how someone they had raised to be kind and responsible could have committed such a horrific act. There were some family members who tried to show him support, claiming that the emotional burden of the betrayal had clouded his judgment, but the guilt of his crime weighed heavily on David. His parents visited him in prison, but their relationship was never the same. The crime rocked the community to its core. The murder of Catherine, followed by the shocking revelation of the affair with David's brother, dominated the news for weeks. The public was divided. Many felt sympathy for David, seeing him as a victim of betrayal who had reacted in a way that was tragically disproportionate. Others, however, were appalled by the cold, calculated nature of his actions, and the fact that it was his own brother who had caused the devastation made the case even more heartbreaking. Local protests sprang up, with some people calling for harsher punishments for men who let jealousy and rage dictate their actions, while others felt the sentence was too severe for someone who had acted in a moment of emotional chaos. Regardless of where people stood on the issue, it was undeniable that David's crime had struck a chord with the public, and his case sparked debates about betrayal, justice, and forgiveness that would continue for years to come. The surviving brother, John, had remained relatively silent throughout the trial, but the outcome of the case hit him hard. He had never imagined that the affair with his sister-in-law would lead to such devastating consequences, and in the aftermath, he was left to grapple with the guilt of being the catalyst for the tragedy. Although John never publicly admitted his own role in the affair, it was clear that the weight of his involvement hung heavy on him. Some believed he felt a sense of responsibility for the death of his sister, and there were even reports of him seeking therapy after the trial. John's relationship with his family was fractured beyond repair. The guilt he carried, combined with the family's anger at him for what had happened, created a rift that could never be healed. While some family members tried to reach out to John and offer him a chance to rebuild, others refused to speak to him altogether. John, for his part, seemed to withdraw from the family, perhaps overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions. The Matthews family, already torn apart by the affair, would never be the same again. The bonds that had once held them together were shattered, and the families would face a long road of healing, if they could heal at all. This case raises so many questions. What do you think really motivated David to take such drastic action? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Comment your theories below, and don't forget to like this video if you found it as shocking as we did. Share this story with others and help keep these conversations going. This case has left us with so many questions, and we'd love to hear your theories. Do you think justice was served, or do you believe there's more to this story than meets the eye? Was the verdict fair? Leave your comments down below, and let's get the conversation started. If you want to hear more chilling true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our latest cases. And if you have any other stories you want us to cover, comment below. We love hearing from you.